Hello everyone, my name's George Butler. I wanted to talk to you about drawing as a language, slightly different language from some of the ones we've heard about this morning, and also the language of our modern news industry and drawing as an alternative for it. I have found that true humanity exists in the most extreme situations. In Iraq and Syria, all those characteristics that we know of, perseverance, loyalty, pride, love, fear, are incredibly visual and available to interact with in places like that. I've also found that truth is a very difficult thing to identify in our world at the moment, and that perhaps the modern news industry isn't always set out for telling some of the stories that have found on the front lines. I've drawn in places like Syria and Iraq and Yemen, and they are my own interpretations done in pen and ink from life. An alternative, they're slow, deliberately slow in fact. If you like, I am the contempt part of what Martin was talking about this morning. I'm trying to offer an alternative. It's not a new idea, of course. The history of creativity, and someone mentioned cultural wisdom this morning, have existed for a long time. This is a famous example of that, also a piece of propaganda, but in 1918, and then further back, the illustrated London News in the 1840s, and of course way back before that as well, examples of original drawings in the caves in Chauvet 25,000 years ago. And this week, I don't know if anyone saw the news of drawings being uncovered in Sulawesi dating back to 48,000 years. So the formula exists already, but in terms of language, I feel like it's a dialect that we are forgetting how to use. And in 2017, in West Mosul, I found myself embedded with the Iraqi army, and it's a very strange relationship. You're kind of looked after for a day by the special forces. So conscious that Patty and Ian are both here, probably done much more of that than me. But I was taken onto a rooftop on the front line. There was a low wall. We were all told to keep our heads down. There were some cameramen there already. One of the images was of a general having a cup of tea, sitting under a roof that kept him away from the visual, of the sight of the drones. And I sat down and quite sort of incongruously, I guess, began to make a drawing whilst they were all filming and interviewing. And then suddenly the general says 30 seconds, and I'm trying to work out what's going on. The cameramen all placed their cameras on the low wall, and they press record. 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 3, 2, 1. You can see where this is going. A missile comes in from the sky. There's an enormous explosion. An ISIS building is blown up a few hundred meters away. We crouch as the kind of dust comes over us. And of course, those clips that had just been made in front of me were distributed around the world. CNN, CBS, BBC, you've seen what they look like. And my drawing of the general having a cup of tea and a cigarette, of course, went largely unnoticed. And in fact, some of you are the first people to see it. But I guess what I learned was that there are many truths of war, and perhaps there are often two, sometimes three versions, and that the language that I'm using can tell a different one. With that in mind, I guess I've made it my mission to be analog in a digital world, and so I guess my greatest tool is to sit down on the floor with a piece of paper and a dip pen, as we'll do in the workshop this afternoon if you're interested, and spend time with people. And originally, of course, I thought... Who's requested this? That's very complicated. Originally, I thought that it was me being a brilliant illustrator going halfway around the world to interact with people. But of course, as a lot of you already know, this is about the process. It's about having time to sit with someone who could so easily have been forgotten by history. And often that interview process, as whether as a journalist or a psychotherapist or a humanitarian worker, is exactly that. It's time to sit with someone, and my excuse is to make a drawing. I recently did that in Ukraine, and I found this extraordinary lady called Madame Olga. She was 99 years old, too frail to get out of her fourth floor apartment when the air raid sirens went off, and in fact too frail to get out of bed at all. When we first arrived there, I was with a translator. She thought that we were there to take her away from her home. She was terrified that we might remove her from Ukraine and that she wouldn't be able to live out her time in her country. And of course, she was also confused and was getting Putin and Hitler muddled. There was great overlap in her mind about what was happening. And yet, in this moment of clarity, she suddenly said, "If you all stop asking questions, I will tell you from the beginning." And she started from the beginning. 1923, she was taken to a collective farm with her father. She survived the Holodomor, which killed 4 million Ukrainians. When the war started, she was taken to Dresden, where she worked as a slave for a Nazi family. She was forced to eat worms. She escaped. Eventually, the war ended, and she herded 130 cows back to Vinnytsia in Ukraine, and met her husband Petro, had 4 children, lived another 80 years until I met her. And it was without that moment to sit that one afternoon, I would never have known her. And it was, I guess, made more extraordinary because several months later she sadly passed away just before her 100th birthday. She left behind her daughter, Valentina, who was there. She was already 79, and a great-great-granddaughter who now lives in Berlin, who's age 7. And it feels like that these parts are important. These stories are important, and of course, the news can promote destruction before social outcome or human story, but to me, they are very valuable. And then at the same time as meeting people like Madame Olga and Vladimir, I'll talk about in a minute, I drew around the edges of the war, and these are some of the things you might have seen on your front pages. The famous Russian convoy in Bucha, perhaps one of the most photographed street scenes, military scenes in the country at the time. And bearing in mind that Ukraine and now possibly Gaza are also the most documented, possibly the most documented moments in history. This was Vladimir, age 7. I drew him after his second operation. He had a bullet lodged in his brain from the accident that also killed his mum, Daria. And although it is seemingly completely miserable and such a sad story, when I sat with him and his father, Stanislav, and we sat in a wardroom and talked about his mum and his little brother, Victor, there was such great hope. That's not an easy thing to say in Ukraine at the moment, but this isn't supposed to be totally sad, I suppose, is what I'm saying. And I hope the drawings give some hope behind the headlines in that sense. This was a coffee shop run by a girl, 17 years old in Odessa. They were waiting for the Russian invasion to come up that piece of coast from the Black Sea, and yet in the middle of the tank traps, which are cut out of old railway line, welded together and placed all over the city, these sort of horrific punctuation marks. Eliza was selling probably a few less coffees than normal, but in there nonetheless, and open for business. These are the sorts of scenes that we have on our 10 o'clock news, and I was drawn into it. I arrived in a place called Kramatorsk. Arrived in a place called Kramatorsk, and I guess we've seen them on our newspapers. The fronts of apartment buildings blown off, all of the belongings have been blown onto the street. There's been a fire, people are collecting them. Some of the Ukrainian volunteers are trying to clear up. The camera teams, the news teams are rolling, they're trying to get interviews. There's a lady here at the front who was collecting her belongings. She was covered in soot. Everybody wanted to, of course, take a photograph of her. And this was happening every morning. And I was drawn into it as well. I sat and drew, and I collected bits of stuff, ephemera from the rubble, things that were no use anymore, and I stuck them on the page in the hope that when they came back to Europe and the UK, that you would better understand what it was like. However, round the corner of that scene, literally the back of the building, my translator, Zvinka, was talking to this man. He was called Petro. He was 70 years old, and he'd been walking past that morning, and at the back of the building, the explosion had blown somebody's library out of their window, and it was lying upside down in a rose garden. And Petro had taken it upon himself to gather the books and put them in little piles. And when we stopped to talk to him, he just said, well, of course, if you saw a loaf of bread on the floor, you would pick it up. These are food for the soul. And he goes, oh, I'm just an ordinary person, and now all you journalists are coming to talk to me, and I'm going to leave. And he wandered off, and never to be seen again. But I felt, again, as I often do on the sort of sidelines of these atrocities, that Petro doesn't get enough airtime. And I don't know how to change that, and be interested to hear what you think about it. But as you can tell, these sorts of scenes and people stick in my mind forevermore, really. Very long way away, that. And again, this is a man called Oleg. He was a ultra football fan. At the weekends, he enjoyed 10-on-10 mixed martial arts fights with other football ultras, organised fights where they tried to beat each other into a pulp. And then during the week, he was an army medic, and I drew him in his home. His mum made us some borscht, and he produced Almond, his guinea pig, who sat on his Kalashnikov as I drew him. And he talked about how he wanted to open a bookshop, a little cafe, when the war was over. And I guess that is a characteristic of war. It gives these very incongruous moments where you have to be able to hold both unbelievable humanity, kindness and generosity, grandfather-like actions in the case of Petro, alongside our ability as humans to be completely revolting. And this is one of those moments, the mass graves. The moment that we realized that everything Ukraine was saying about Russia was, of course, true. And that day outside St. Andrew's Church in Bucha, they were exhuming the bodies I think they pulled out 20 bodies that day and lying them on the ground in front of the church. At the back there is the dark sort of blob is the residents from the town who were waiting to see if there was any news of the people that had gone missing in the occupation. And then on our side, as it were, this strange dividing line, were the press, and I was standing with them taking pictures and I guess trying to get as much coverage as possible, and that's always a great inner conflict for everyone. There are other stories as well in the book. This is Lisa. She stayed up every night to take photographs from space as part of the National Space Program. She took photographs of Russian positions and sent them to her superiors. The whole of her office had left when the war started, all 300 of them, mostly men, mostly 50-year-old men higher up in the military. They'd all gone to Lviv, but she was a 26-year-old woman. She stayed behind. Her brother was in the army. She had a twin. And at the end of our interview, there was this very kind of sweet moment because I asked her, the audio, whenever the audio stops rolling, you get the most interesting bits. And I said to her, "Are you married? Where's your husband?" She obviously assumed wrongly. And she laughed and said, and whispered, "No, I'm gay, but you can't tell anybody because if you tell them, I'll never be promoted." And so I obviously promised that none of this would ever be produced, and I didn't think about it again. But a few months later, when I was about to publish the book, she sent me a message saying, "I've reconsidered. I don't see that there's a future for me in the army. I'd like you to publish my full name and my full orientation. All my friends are DJs, and I've got no future." And I think that gave a real sense to me of the sort of attitude in Ukraine at the moment. There's still so many things that we have about that society that we have forgotten that still need overcoming, and it's very easy to think of it as black and white terms, good against bad, but of course, like all societies, it has its issues with corruption, racism, and of course homophobia, as described by Lisa, and I think that's worth remembering as well. And then there are moments, of course, where I'm also, as an artist, just trying to make good-looking pictures of things that I like drawing. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this afternoon if you come to the workshop, about the white space that illustrations give, the difference between them and photographs. So easy to, I guess, to be drawn in by the brilliant mechanical allure of photography, and forget that the drawing is what happens in the white space and around the edges. This was Anton. He was a pilot. I sat with him in one of these extraordinary interviews where I wasn't allowed to ask him any questions because he was much, much more valuable than the helicopter itself, and so nobody wanted anybody else to know where he lived or who he was. And so I came away thinking this was a complete waste of time, and then almost immediately afterwards I get a message on Instagram saying, "Hello, it's Anton. I've just started an Instagram account. Please ask me any questions." And so there's this public-facing Ukraine pride and paranoia where there's no information disseminated at all. And then, of course, over the course of a drawing or a morning, suddenly there's a connection which allows two people to talk. And that happened again on the front line with an artillery unit. They had been shelled that morning, dug underground under some logs and then covered in mud, so they couldn't be hit. But when I arrived, the situation was so tense. They were all excited to see us because we were probably the first people they'd seen for days, but also completely wired. They were trying to decide whether to pick up the truck and move, which was a dangerous time to do it, or to dig deeper into the ground, because now the Russians knew where they were. It would be more dangerous. And yet, eventually we sat down to talk to them, and I tried to do a drawing. Alexander, the man behind, had been a volunteer in the zoo. It had been his job to remove the wolves from the zoo before they were shelled. And he told this very funny story of how he had to put a wolf to sleep. What's it called? Not euthanize, no, it didn't kill it, just put it to sleep. And he put it in the back of his car. And at every checkpoint he got to, they said, "Can I see in the back of the car?" And he said, "You can, but I've got a wolf in there and we shouldn't wake it up." And they obviously insisted to see it. And then he would go around the back of the car and he'd open the door and there's this enormous wolf lying in the back seat. And then he'd close the door and he'd go to the next checkpoint, it'd happen again. And he moved them all the way to Dnipro. But he said the saddest thing was moving the monkeys, because when they were shot at or they heard the explosions, he said that they screamed like humans. And that's really stuck in my mind. And then, of course, the scenes that we all remember from, in Britain in 1942, Belsize Park, Henry Moore drew those figures sleeping on the metro. We thought that we'd committed these scenes to the history books, and yet 2022 and still now in Kharkiv, people are trying to get away from the Russian bombardment. This is a man called Artem. I was given this contact by a Wall Street journalist whose editor told her that the story wasn't interesting enough, and so it was the sort of thing that I picked up on. He was a sort of thuggish-looking man, but he'd started a jellyfish museum in the middle of Kiev in the middle of the war because he believed it was the only place that people could come and for a moment be away from the things that were so present in their minds. And the way he talked about it and sort of explained his reason for it was so moving, and yet, I guess, easily forgotten if it hadn't been for me to be able to draw him, I think. At the same time as making all of these drawings, I sat and interviewed them, and in the book, which looks like this, I tried to keep my words out of it as much as possible, actually. It was a chance for them to tell their stories, and the drawings became, like Paul Hogarth used to describe, they became a handshake, but really the work started once they started to talk, and it really taught me a lesson, actually, that the drawing was just a very small part of that process, and that their words are the bits that, in a way, have been written onto my heart and into my mind, I guess, forevermore. People living in the hospital corridors, not because the hospitals were too busy, but because they were one more wall away from any explosions, no windows in the corridors, so it felt safer for them. And this life, I guess, continues at the moment in Kharkiv. Really, these are the stories that you don't find on your front pages. They are so easily lost, I guess. But in my experience, they are a more common human experience, and one that I think should perhaps be better promoted. Should change. And as I said before, I learned in Ukraine that really it was their stories that made the content for this book above, or I should perhaps better describe that. I think it's so easy to have pictures on a wall in London or in New York that look smart in a white frame, or you can have the stories, as I try and explain to you now, the realities of Ukraine, but really their words and my moment with them was about the process, and that's so difficult to capture. I think in a world dominated by one-liners, misinformation, fake news, I think it's really easy to perhaps forget some of the more human moments. And so I think my question, I'm not going to take any questions from you because it's nearly lunchtime or coffee time, but my question, I guess, for everyone is about truth. And I would like some answers to this because I haven't worked it out. But my question is, in that world that we now know where the news is controlled by a few and it's easy to reel off the one-liners or the fake news or the misinformation, what's to say that an illustration that doesn't pretend to be anything but is done from life in that moment, what's to say that it can't be as truthful as the next image that we find that may be AI generated, that may not be, and when it's run alongside an image that we don't always trust its originality. And I think that's my question to you. I wanted to finish with this story from a different part of the world. Also so difficult, of course, to hold two different disasters in our minds. The one that we were so outraged about 3 or 4 months ago, the next one that's coming down the line, how do we stay outraged enough? And this is a drawing from the Turkish earthquake. It was published in The Guardian in February last year. It is the Bucha apartment building on the 5th day of the rescue, 8 floors that had collapsed in on itself shortly after 4/17 when the earthquake started. And the world scrambled to try and rescue those people. I remember the dust, we were all covered in dust. I remember sometimes we were walking down the street, you get the smell of the bodies in the concrete. And I remember the silence. Whenever they thought that they had found somebody, they would stop the entire street. All the machines would stop, not just in the building, and then they would tap on the concrete or a piece of metal and hope that there would be a response. And opposite, if that scene wasn't horrific enough, sat all of their relatives waiting days 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 to see if anybody from their families could be rescued. And I felt, I guess, quite an imposter standing there drawing. They pulled out all their seats from the nearby houses. They'd made fires so they could sit on them and stay warm. The most important thing was to try and be together. And in this moment of sort of insecurity that I always have when I'm standing there, feeling strange and like a foreigner, this young man comes up to me called Uday, and I think I'm in for it here. And he leans over my shoulder and says, "That's my grandfather and my dad and my mother. What are you doing here?" And we have a bit of a conversation. And then he takes the pencil out of my hand and he says, could you send me a copy? And I look at him like, this is going to get me in trouble. And he can see that I'm worried, and he starts to write his number on the top of the page, the top right. And he says, no, it's so that we can remember. And I think that's the point. I'd like you to try and remember that. And that's been my sort of secret mission, if you like, to the people that I've drawn. If nothing else, just to remember. Thank you. Yeah.